The house was unbearably quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that made every small sound feel louder than it should. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to pulse against the walls, fighting off the heat that clung stubbornly to the windows. I sat curled up on the couch, phone in hand, pretending to scroll through something important when in reality I was just avoiding her. My stepmom moved around the kitchen behind me, the soft sound of bare feet on tile marking her presence. I could feel her there, even without turning around, the faint scent of her shampoo drifting into the living room every time she passed by. She had been different lately. Not in a way I could easily explain, but in small glances that lingered too long, in the way her words seemed to carry meanings I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was reading into things because of my own restless thoughts. Still, I kept my distance, letting the gap between us grow with every day that passed. "You haven't been outside all day," she said finally, her voice calm but with a warmth that seemed to wrap around me. I mumbled something about being tired, not looking up, my eyes fixed on the same spot on my phone screen for far longer than I should have. She didn't push, just moved closer, the sound of the refrigerator door opening filling the room before she let it close with a soft thud. I tried to focus on anything else, anything, but I could feel her eyes on me, a weight that made my skin warm under my t-shirt. When I finally looked up, she was standing at the edge of the couch, her hair damp, drops of water sliding down the side of her neck. She was wrapped in a towel, one hand holding it in place. "The pool's warm today," she said, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "You should come join me." My throat tightened, and I forced a laugh that sounded far too awkward. "I'm good," I said quickly, my gaze darting back to my phone. But something in her expression lingered in my mind, an almost knowing look, like she could see through every excuse I had been clinging to. She lingered a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the back door. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my chest tight with something I couldn't quite name. I told myself I was doing the right thing by keeping my distance, but deep down, part of me wondered how much longer I could pretend not to notice. The minutes after she stepped outside felt strangely heavy, like the air in the room had shifted in her absence. I could hear the faint splash of water from the backyard, each sound pulling at my attention no matter how much I tried to keep my eyes on my phone. I told myself to ignore it, to stay put, but the image of her, hair damp, towel clinging to her skin, kept replaying in my mind in quiet, intrusive loops. My thoughts were interrupted when I caught sight of her through the sliding glass door, sitting at the edge of the pool with her legs in the water. The sun hit her in a way that made everything seem slower, the shimmer of light bouncing off the surface and catching on her skin. She tilted her head back, eyes closed, her expression soft and almost content. Something about it made my chest feel tight, though I couldn't say if it was discomfort or something else. I stood without thinking, telling myself I was just going to get a drink. But when I reached the kitchen, I found my gaze sliding toward the glass again, lingering longer than it should have. She must have felt it, because her head turned, and our eyes met through the distance. There was no smile this time, just a steady, unreadable look that made me freeze where I stood. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet, water dripping from her calves as she walked to the edge of the pool and reached for the towel she had left on the chair. Instead of wrapping it around herself immediately, she draped it loosely over her shoulders, the sunlight catching on the thin straps of her swimsuit. "It's too nice to waste the day inside," she called out, her voice carrying easily through the glass. I didn't answer, but she took a step closer to the door, her presence somehow filling the kitchen even from outside. "You've been avoiding me," she said quietly, almost like it wasn't meant to be heard. My stomach nodded, because she wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she slid the door open halfway, leaning against the frame, her eyes never leaving mine. The warmth from outside crept in, mingling with the faint scent of chlorine and sun-warmed skin. "Come on," she said softly, the hint of a challenge in her tone. "Just 5 minutes." And for the first time, I felt the smallest crack in my resolve. I told myself I was only stepping outside to be polite, to stop the silent tug-of-war that had been building between us. The heat hit me first, wrapping around me in a thick wave that made the cool, blue water look almost painfully inviting. She stepped back to let me through, her hand brushing lightly against my arm as I passed, a touch so brief it could have been accidental, yet it lingered in my mind. I hovered near the pool's edge, unsure of what to do with myself. She moved gracefully into the water, her head dipping beneath the surface before she came up again, slicking her hair back with both hands. "Feels amazing," she said, tilting her head toward me with a knowing look. "You're going to regret it if you don't get in." I laughed quietly, shaking my head, but my gaze kept following the way the water clung to her shoulders. She swam to the shallow end, resting her arms on the edge where I stood. "You've been so tense lately," she murmured, her voice low enough that it almost felt like a secret. "You need to loosen up." My pulse quickened, and I shifted my weight, feeling the heat of the sun on my skin but an entirely different warmth spreading somewhere deeper. She reached up suddenly, her fingers brushing lightly against my ankle in the water. It wasn't much, just a light touch, but it made my breath hitch. "See? Not so bad," she said with a faint smile, as if she was testing the waters in more ways than one. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Instead, she turned and drifted backward into the deeper end, her eyes holding mine until the distance between us felt like more than just a few feet of pool water. The silence was thick, filled with things unsaid, and for the first time, I wondered if ignoring her was only making me want to know more. I finally sat down at the edge of the pool, dipping my feet into the water. It was warmer than I expected, the kind of warmth that made it easier to imagine slipping all the way in. She floated lazily in the center, watching me with a calm patience that made me feel more exposed than if she'd been staring outright. The sun was starting to sink lower, casting a softer light over everything, and it seemed to wrap the scene in a kind of quiet intimacy. "You always hold yourself back," she said suddenly, her voice carrying over the gentle ripples. I frowned, not sure how to answer, but she kept going. "You think too much. You stay on the edge, where it's safe." There was no judgment in her tone, just observation, and maybe a hint of something else I couldn't quite name. I tried to brush it off with a shrug, but she swam closer, the water parting around her as she moved. When she reached me, she rested her hands on the edge beside my legs, looking up with eyes that seemed to search right through me. "You don't have to be afraid here," she said quietly. The words made my chest tighten, and I hated how much they got to me. Before I could think too hard about it, she stood, water sliding down her body in thin streams, and stepped up onto the pool deck. The towel she'd left nearby was waiting, but she didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she stayed there, close enough that I could feel the water dripping onto my skin, her gaze locked on mine. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, she let the towel slip from her shoulders and fall to the ground. I froze, caught somewhere between shock and something far more dangerous, my breath shallow as the heat of the moment settled heavy between us. My eyes betrayed me before my mind could catch up, drawn instinctively to the way the last light of the sun traced every curve of her, the water on her skin catching the glow like glass. I told myself to look away, to not let the moment sink its hooks into me, but my body stayed still, locked in place as if moving would shatter whatever fragile tension hung between us. She didn't speak, just watched me with that same unreadable expression, the corners of her mouth curving into something faint, something that felt almost like satisfaction. The air was thick, not just with the heat but with the weight of everything I'd tried to avoid for weeks. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, and she stepped closer, her bare feet silent against the deck. The scent of chlorine mixed with her faint perfume, and it made my head feel strangely light. "You notice," she murmured, her voice low and certain, "you've always noticed." It wasn't a question, and I didn't try to deny it. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly along my jaw in a way that made me forget how to breathe for a moment. The touch was gone as quickly as it came, but the ghost of it lingered, sparking something deep in my chest. She moved past me then, picking up the towel from the ground, but instead of wrapping it around herself, she simply draped it loosely over one arm. "You should come in," she said again, her tone softer now, almost coaxing. My legs felt unsteady as I stood, the pool water lapping at my calves when I stepped down into the shallow end. She watched every move, her eyes dark with something I couldn't name, and for the first time I didn't look away. I let the water rise around me, feeling the heat of the day fade as the coolness settled over my skin. But even in the water, I couldn't escape the way she made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to name. The water closed around me with a gentle weight, muting the sounds of the world beyond the pool. She was only a few steps away, the faint ripples she made reaching me before she did. For a moment we just floated there in silence, the air between us charged with something unspoken. I tried to tell myself this was nothing, that she was just being playful, that I was overthinking, but her gaze held mine like an anchor, steady and deliberate. She moved closer, slow enough that I could have backed away if I wanted to, but I didn't. The warmth of her presence wrapped around me even through the water. "See? Not so bad," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of satisfaction, like she'd been waiting for this small surrender. I tried to smirk, to brush it off, but the curve of her mouth deepened like she could see right through the act. Her hands skimmed the surface of the water before she let her fingers trail lightly along my arm. It was such a simple touch, but it left a shiver in its wake, one that had nothing to do with the water's temperature. My heart beat faster, and I hated that she could probably hear it in my voice when I finally spoke. "You've been different lately," I said, not meaning for it to sound so uncertain. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Maybe you're just starting to notice," she replied, her tone a mix of challenge and invitation. The space between us was barely more than a breath now, the soft lap of water the only sound filling the gap. I didn't move when her hand came to rest lightly at my waist, the gesture both grounding and disarming. The world outside the pool felt far away, and in that quiet bubble, I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what she might do next, or of what I might let happen. Her touch lingered just long enough for me to feel the heat of it even through the water, a warmth that spread through me in slow, deliberate waves. I should have stepped back, should have created space before it became something I couldn't take back, but my body betrayed me, rooted to the spot as if moving would break whatever fragile current was flowing between us. She searched my face with a quiet intensity, her eyes flicking briefly to my lips before meeting my gaze again. The air felt heavier, each breath harder to take, and I realized my pulse was keeping time with the soft ripples against my skin. "You always keep people at arm's length," she said, her voice so low I almost thought I imagined it. "But I don't think you want to keep me there." My throat tightened, the truth of her words sinking in deeper than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words tangled before they could form, and all I managed was a quiet, uncertain breath. She smiled faintly, not with amusement but with a kind of quiet knowing, as though she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Her thumb brushed against my side under the water, a small movement that felt far too intimate for how little space separated us. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing beyond her eyes, her touch, the steady pull that kept me from stepping away. My chest rose and fell in shallow, careful breaths, and for the first time I realized that ignoring her had never been about disinterest, it had been about fear. Fear of what might happen if I stopped resisting. And now, standing there with her so close, I wasn't sure I could anymore. Her fingers tightened slightly at my waist, not enough to pull me closer but enough to make it clear she didn't want me to move away. The silence between us stretched, the weight of it pressing into my skin until I felt like I might break under it. The soft slosh of water filled the space where words should have been, every sound amplified in the still evening air. I could feel the last of the sunlight fading, the pool slowly slipping into shadow, but she was still illuminated, her face warm in the lingering glow. "You don't have to be afraid," she said at last, her tone softer than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't a demand, it was permission. I took a slow breath, my chest tight, and for once I didn't look away. Something inside me shifted then, a small surrender I'd been holding back for far too long. She stepped in that last inch of space, the water rippling around us as our bodies aligned. The closeness was overwhelming, every detail magnified, the faint scent of her skin, the cool droplets sliding down from her hair, the heat radiating between us despite the water. My hands found her without thinking, resting lightly at her sides, and she exhaled as if she'd been waiting for that touch. For a moment, we simply stayed like that, suspended in something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. When she finally leaned in, her forehead brushed mine, a quiet pause that made my breath catch. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't forced. It was an answer to a question neither of us had spoken aloud. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I realized there was no going back. Whatever came next would change everything, but for once, I didn't care. And if you've been holding back from something, or someone, because of fear, maybe it's time to take that step. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that pull you under and keep you there.